On December 15, 1976, a British government official signed a document in a London hotel. The document was a letter of intent addressed to the International Monetary Fund in exchange for a $3.9 billion loan, the largest in IMF history at that time. The United Kingdom agreed to cut public spending and surrender partial control of its economic policy to an outside institution. Britain wasn't a developing nation. It had won the Second World War. It had built the National Health Service. It held a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. And yet, in 1976, the markets had decided that the British government could no longer be trusted to manage its own finances. That moment is the one that most people skipped. The debate today starts in 1979. It starts with Margaret Thatcher. It starts with pit closures and miners and the decimation of the industrial North. But the files tell a different story. The decline didn't begin in 1979. It was already well underway years before anyone had heard of Thatcherism. If that interests you, subscribe, because this channel covers what most people slept through. Part 1. The World Britain Built. To understand what Britain lost, you have to understand what Britain was. For most of the 19th century, the United Kingdom was the manufacturing center of the world. At its peak in the 1870s, British factories accounted for nearly 23% of global manufacturing output. The country that invented the steam engine, the locomotive, and the industrial assembly line was, for a time, the single most productive economy on Earth. That era didn't end overnight, but it did end. By 1938, Britain's share of world manufacturing had fallen to under 11%. By 1973, it had dropped below 5%. The decline had structural causes that predate any one government. British industry was old. Built in the Victorian era, the factories and mills of the North had been running for generations without the capital investment their German and Japanese competitors had been forced to make after the Second World War. Those countries rebuilt from rubble. They installed modern equipment. Their factories were newer, faster, and more efficient. Britain's were not. By the early 1960s, economists were already using a phrase to describe the UK's position in Europe. They called it the British disease: low investment, low productivity, an industrial base that was falling behind, a workforce locked into adversarial patterns with management. Strikes were frequent. Output was unpredictable. Foreign buyers began to look elsewhere. In 1967, the pound was devalued for the second time since the war. The government called it a managed correction. The markets called it a sign. Inflation was rising. Growth was weak. And a series of governments, both conservative and labor, responded by propping up industries that were already losing the global competition. Subsidies flowed to coal mines, steel plants, and car factories that were operating at a fraction of their potential. This is not revisionism. This is the documented record. Part 2. A decade of structural failure. The internal diagnosis was not kind. By the early 1970s, the evidence from inside government was clear. Britain's manufacturing base had begun to lose employment not in 1979, but in the mid-1960s. Academic economists writing in the period, including those commissioned by the U.S. Brookings Institution in 1968, concluded that British growth was weak due to chronic underinvestment and poor productivity. Their report, Britain's Economic Prospects, said this directly. The problem was not cyclical. It was structural. The numbers support this. Manufacturing as a share of GDP was already falling. From around 30% in 1970, it would decline throughout the decade. Meanwhile, between 1973 and 1992, the total growth in British manufactured output was just 1.3%. Over the same period, Japan grew its manufacturing output by nearly 69%. West Germany grew by 32%. Even France, with its own industrial difficulties, managed 16.5%. Then came the energy crisis. In 1973, OPEC, the oil cartel, cut production and quadrupled the price of oil. The British economy, heavily dependent on fossil fuels, was hit hard. Inflation, already elevated, began to spiral. By 1975, it had reached 25%. That means that prices were rising by a quarter every single year. A pound in 1974 was worth significantly less by 1975. Savings were being eroded. Workers demanded higher wages. Companies raised prices. The cycle accelerated. In 1974 alone, British workers lost more than 14 million working days to strikes. The miners went out. The dock workers went out. At one point, the government introduced a 3-day working week, limiting industry to just 3 days of electricity use to conserve coal. Offices worked by candlelight. Shops closed early. The country that had powered the Industrial Revolution could not keep its own lights on. By 1976, the fiscal situation was beyond what the markets would accept. Britain was running a budget deficit close to 10% of GDP. Sterling was falling, and the government's foreign exchange reserves were nearly exhausted. In September 1976, the pound hit its lowest point since floating, dropping from $2 to just $1.57 in a matter of months. On September 28, 1976, Chancellor Denis Healey was at Heathrow Airport, boarding a plane to the IMF conference in Manila. The pound was collapsing in real time. He turned back at the gate. The next day, he announced that Britain was applying for the largest IMF loan in the fund's history. Part 3. What the public was told. The official story was managed carefully. A government framed the IMF loan as a precautionary measure, a tool for stabilization. The Chancellor told the Labour Party conference in Blackpool that Britain's fundamentals were sound, that this was a temporary adjustment, a response to external shocks, not evidence of deep failure. That framing was disputed at the time, and it is disputed now. The OMFIF's own assessment was blunt. According to the loan negotiations, the fund told the British government that its problems were not primarily caused by the oil shock. They were, in the IMF's own words, deep-seated and long-standing. The diagnosis included an antiquated industrial structure, high marginal tax rates, low capital formation, and poor industrial relations between unions and management. This was not a temporary crisis. It was the bill for decades of deferred restructuring. The political difficulty was profound. The Labour government was ideologically committed to protecting jobs and maintaining public services. Accepting IMF conditions meant cutting public spending, the opposite of what its own base demanded. The cabinet was divided. The left, led by Tony Benn, argued against the cuts. The centrists, led by Healey and Prime Minister James Callaghan, argued there was no alternative. A Wall Street Journal headline at the time captured the external view simply, "Goodbye, Great Britain." It wasn't goodbye, but it was a turning point. The loan was agreed, spending was cut, interest rates were raised, and Britain entered a period of managed austerity under a Labour government, 3 years before Margaret Thatcher ever entered Downing Street. Part 4. What the closures actually cost. The coal industry, by the time it became the symbolic battleground of the 1980s, was already in a structural decline that had been building for 60 years. In the 1920s, 1 million people were employed in British coal. That figure had been falling consistently since. By the time Thatcher's government faced the miners' strike in 1984, global coal prices had shifted, energy markets were changing, and the case for continued subsidy had, by almost any economic measure, become very difficult to make. This does not mean the closures were managed well. They were not. Communities in South Wales, the Northeast, Yorkshire, and Scotland were devastated in ways that went beyond economics. The social infrastructure of those towns, their purpose, their identity, their tax base, collapsed alongside the pits. Since the mid-1960s, UK manufacturing has shed more than 6 million jobs. The regions that bore the weight of this collapse, former mining towns, steel communities, textile towns, have still not fully recovered. Research into the long-term consequences of sudden industrial job loss shows persistent health effects, reduced life expectancy, and lower social mobility that continue to be felt across generations. The regional economic divide this created is measurable. London and the Southeast attracted the financial services investment, the law firms, the technology companies. The North, the Midlands, South Wales, and much of Scotland were left with derelict industrial land and a workforce whose skills had no market. Manufacturing as a share of British GDP, which was 30% in 1970, now sits at around 8%. The UK's share of global manufacturing output, which was close to 23% in the 1870s, is today a fraction of that figure. These numbers trace an arc of decline that spans more than a century, not just one decade. Part 5. What it means today. The debate about reindustrialization is happening right now. In June 2026, Andy Burnham entered Parliament, having won one of the most watched by-elections in recent British history. His pitch to Labour's base includes a call for a new industrial strategy, reindustrializing the North, investing in communities that were abandoned, rebuilding a manufacturing base. That is a politically potent message, and some parts of it are backed by real plans. Greater Manchester, under Burnham's tenure as mayor, became the UK's fastest-growing city region since 2015, growing productivity at 3.1% annually and attracting more foreign direct investment than any UK region outside London. His reindustrialization blueprint focuses on high-value clusters in digital, health innovation, advanced materials, and low-carbon technology, not the industries of the past, the industries of the next 30 years. That distinction matters enormously. Britain cannot compete with low-cost manufacturing in Asia. It never will again. The wages, the land costs, the regulatory environment, none of it makes the economics work. Any attempt to recreate the industrial economy of 1965 would require permanent, escalating subsidy. It would be a political project, not an economic one. The documents tell us what works. The UK's AI sector generated £23.9 billion in revenue in 2024 and grew by 85% in just 2 years. The government's own projections suggest AI could add £550 billion to British GDP by 2035. Life sciences support 400,000 jobs and attract more government R&D spending as a share of GDP than almost any country outside the United States. Financial services account for close to 10% of UK GDP. Advanced manufacturing, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, precision engineering generates £80.6 billion in value added each year. These are the industries where Britain competes. These are the sectors where the skills, the universities, the intellectual property, and the institutional infrastructure already exist. The question facing every British politician in 2026 is not whether to industrialize. It is which industries to back, and whether the country has the patience and the capital to build them into global leaders before the competition does. Henry Kissinger, in the 1970s, called Britain's economic situation a tragedy. He wasn't wrong about the 1970s. Whether the same words apply to the next decade is a question of choices, not of fate. The 1976 IMF loan was repaid. The economy stabilized. North Sea oil revenues, rising through the late 1970s, gave the government breathing room. But the structural problems the IMF identified in 1976, low investment, poor industrial strategy, short-termism in both business and government, were never fully resolved. They are still being debated today. This is why the story doesn't start in 1979, and this is why the decisions made in the next decade matter more than any politician will admit in public. Most people slept through this. You didn't. Subscribe, because there's more.